Hi everyone, today I am sharing a free pattern and sewing tutorial for this tie knot bag. You will find the pattern linked in the description below. I'm Tess from Tess Jean Patterns. I create sewing patterns and tutorials for clothes and accessories you will genuinely love wearing. I went through all of these mock-ups, perfecting the shape and figuring out the simplest, most user-friendly construction. So after all of the testing and tweaking, I am finally ready to share this bag with you. This bag is really versatile. It works perfectly as a casual day bag, or you can pair it with a more dressed up look. It's fully lined and features a zip closure, and I've designed the construction so the zip is really easy to insert, so no tricky corners to deal with. A key feature is this beautiful modern tie detail that knots around the strap and then hangs loose. This version here I made in a suede leather, and I love how the shape softens in the slouchy suede. However, I only just managed to sew this on my industrial sewing machine. I think the sponginess of the suede was a lot thicker than I expected. So I made another version in a thinner suede, and this is it here. So it's just as beautiful, and you can absolutely sew this on your home sewing machine. It was incredibly easy to sew. You can sew this bag in whatever material you like, a canvas, a denim, a PU leather, lambskin, suede, they would all work. I just recommend finding something quite soft and malleable so it works with the curve of the zip, and definitely test out some thick fabric or leather scraps on your sewing machine to see what it can comfortably handle. For today's video, I'm making the bag in a PU leather. Now, I wouldn't normally choose this material because it's actually a bit stiff, but I had it lying around the studio and it's fine for demonstrating the construction. So let's get started and make this bag. This is what you need today. Leather hides or your fabric. So if you're sewing leather, I would take the pattern with you to lay out on the hides to ensure you have enough and you're avoiding any natural flaws on the leather. If you're sewing fabric, you'll need about 0.85 meters, which is roughly 0.9 yards. And the fabric should be at least 110 centimeters wide. That's 44 inches. And for the lining, you'll need about 0.4 meters or around half a yard. And that needs to be at least 110 centimeters wide or 44 inches. You'll need a number 5 zipper around 38 to 40 centimeters long. Now, number 5 just means the zipper teeth measure 5 millimeters wide when closed. The finished zipper on the bag is 32 centimeters or 12.6 inches, but you need a few extra centimeters on each end for sewing. You need wire cutters for removing the metal zipper teeth, heavy duty sewing thread, a little bit of iron-on fusing, a sewing foot and a zipper sewing foot. These should be in Teflon if you're sewing leather or a PU leather. Heavy duty needle depending on the thickness of your leather or your fabric. I'm using size 100 today. And then also these sewing clips are so good to hold your pieces together because pins will leave punch holes in your leather. And finally, a flexible but firm material for the base. This is optional, but I think the bag does look better with it. I used a 3mm thick EVA foam. You need 9 by 33 centimeters or in inches 3.5 by 13. For the PDF pattern, you can print in either A0, A4 or US letter. This one here is printed in A4 and there are 12 sheets. Print the page with the scale check first and measure the square to make sure the pattern has printed at the correct scale. And for tiling your sheets together, match the corresponding numbers and letters, cut down the lines, align and tape together. This is what it looks like when it's all pieced together, then cut out your pattern. Any notches on the pattern, just cut out little triangles, and the seam allowance is super easy. It's 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch across all of the pattern pieces. Lay out your main fabric right way up, single layer. Each pattern piece has a grain line, so if you're cutting fabric, align your grain line with the selvage. If you're cutting leather, then disregard the grain line on the main bag because you'll rotate your pieces around to fit on the hides.
cut one pair of the main body, one pair of the tie, and the long and short center strap pieces. For the lining, it is cut 2 on the fold. Mark the center notches on the fold of the fabric too. For the notches, I make tiny snips. Careful you don't make these too deep and cut into the stitching line. Once everything is cut out, I like to bundle all of my pieces together and we're ready to sew. Now, my lining fabric frays a lot, so I'm going to overlock the outside edges of the bag linings, but not the curved opening because we'll be sewing that first, so hopefully it won't have frayed. And overlock all the edges of the lining center strap pieces too. I'd suggest doing this if your lining also frays. Before sewing, we need to remove the excess metal teeth in the zipper because we won't be able to sew through them. So measure 32 centimeters and mark. Trim off any excess tape so you have around 3 centimeters or 1 inch spare each end. Now, using pliers, carefully remove the teeth up to your marks. You'll either love or hate this. I find this so satisfying. They do tend to fly out in all directions, so be really careful with your eyes and maybe put some glasses on. This is what the zip looks like when done. The last step before sewing is setting up your machine to handle thicker material. So use heavy duty thread for the top thread and regular thread in the bobbin. Change to a Teflon foot if you need it, but a zipper foot. I have the wrong one on here. Install a heavy duty needle and increase your stitch length to around 3.5 to 4. You'll probably need to loosen the tension to accommodate for the thicker thread. I had to test it a few times before getting the tension right and was good to go. First, we're going to sew the center straps onto the ends of the zip. I spent a lot of time figuring out the easiest way to install the zip with a lining, and this method worked best. Get your zip, the long and short center straps that are cut in your main fabric, and the 2 lining straps. Starting with the top of the zip, mark 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch up from the metal teeth. This is so we know where to align the edge of the strap pieces because the zip ends are quite long. Make sure to mark both sides. Next, take your long center strap piece, find the end with a notch, and right side facing down onto the zip. Align the edge with your 1 centimeter mark, ensuring the notch is in the middle of the zipper. Squeeze the sides together as close as possible. We're going to stay stitch this in place and close the end. Making sure to sew less than a 1 centimeter seam or 3/8 of an inch. Stitch the zipper end to the long center strap. Now turn your zip over and get your lining piece and sandwich them together, right sides facing in. Align the edges and this time sew a 1 centimeter seam as close as you can to the metal zipper teeth. This is what the ends are looking like now. It's been neatly bagged out. We want to remove the thickness in the seams, so trim your seam allowance in half, and now we can cut off the excess zipper tape too. Then fold both sides back. If you're working with leather, you won't be able to iron it, so just smooth the seams flat with your fingers. Edge stitch the seam. Once that's done, we're going to do exactly the same to the other end of the zip. So this time using the short center strap and the last remaining lining piece. There we have it. A zip is ready to be installed, but for now, just put it to the side. We're going to work on the tie. Get your tie pieces and put right sides together. The notched end is the open end, so we can turn it out later. Clip or pin your tie together, then starting at the notched end, sew a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam. Trim the seam allowance in half to reduce the bulk. At the corners, carefully trim as close as you can to the stitch line, then turn your tie out. The corners are a little tricky to pull out, so use a blunt stick or a pencil. I'm using a chopstick to push them out. Gently wiggle the fabric to push the seam outwards so it doesn't fold over itself, and then clip the edges in place to hold it. To make sure the heavier top stitching shows on the tie once it's knotted, be sure to top stitch this side of the tie. In this video, I'm top stitching from the wrong side. So when you're sewing your tie, the pointy end should be on the right.
Top stitch an 8mm seam or just over 1/4 inch around the edges, basically just past where you've trimmed your seam allowance so it's not too thick to sew. Now match the center notch on the tie with this notch on the pattern, which is on the shorter strap of the bag. This is the face side of the tie with a nice heavy top stitching. Flip it over and align those notches. So take note, the tie is lying on a diagonal out to the left with the pointy end up the top. Clip your tie in place and stay stitch, making sure you're stitching less than 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch to hold it in place. Now that's stitched down, you can also see the direction of the tie. Next is the zip. Fold your zip in half, matching your seams together, and mark the centers. We want to make tiny clips into both sides of the tape, so here I'm clipping about 10 centimeters each end. These are just small cuts, about 6mm or 1/4 inch deep. So when this zip is sewn to the bag, the zipper tape is more flexible around the corners. Once you've clipped your tape, get the shorter end of your zip and face down, align the seam with this notch on the bag. These are your zip notches with the center zip notch there. Clip your zip down and sew just shy of 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch along your zip. You'll need the zipper foot on your machine. We're sewing slightly less than 1 centimeter because next we will stitch the lining and sew just past our existing stitch line. Take your time with this, pausing and checking as you go that the center of the zip aligns with the center notch of the bag. And then the seam at the other end of your zip, the long end, should align with the zip notch, and then the ends should match. This is what it's looking like. Next, we're going to sew one side of the lining in. With the right side of your lining face down, place it on top of your zip. The top edges should align with the edge of the lining center strap, so this line on the bag. Clip it in place. Turn your bag over as we will sew the lining from this side. We want to stitch just past the existing stitch line, so about 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. Sew through the main, the zip, and the lining layers. Again, take your time to match the notches as you sew. You don't need to sew all the way, just to the ends of your lining. Now, the curves of the bag opening have a bit of tension, so cut out little triangles along here to release the tightness. After that, flip your lining over so you have a nice finished side of the zip. You can see on my bag that my lining edges aren't quite matching. If it's the same for you, don't worry about it because this section is hidden in the straps and you don't see it. The next step is to reduce the bulkiness in the seam. So on the long strap of the bag, measure roughly down 3 centimeters, like 1 inch would be fine. Mark and then clip into your seam line. So obviously don't cut into your stitching. Fold the seam allowance in the opposite direction and then trim the top layer of the seam in half. I like to put a little clip here to hold it in place. On the opposite side of the bag, do the same, but leave the seam allowance lying flat the way it wants to lie and only trim back the top layer. This means when it's sewn together later, the two seam allowances will be lying in opposite directions, so it won't be as thick. I recommend clipping or pinning your lining to the edges of the bag to help pull it off the zip. We are going to edge stitch this side of the zip to flatten it all. You'll need to gently pull out the lining off the zip as you sew to make sure it's not folding or bunching on that seam line. And that's one side of the bag done. The zip is the trickiest part of the construction, so we are nearly there. Now remember how I said you needed a tiny bit of iron-on fusing? We are going to use that now before going any further because we need to reinforce the ends. On the inside of your 4 straps, making sure you're working on the wrong side, measure down 5 centimeters, about 2 inches, and mark it. I'm just using a pencil here because it won't be visible. Next, cut 4 small squares of iron-on fusing. It doesn't matter really how big these are, they just need to be bigger than the 1 centimeter seam allowance. Press each square over the marked spot. Use a low dry heat, so no steam, especially if you're sewing with suede because steam can discolor it. And also use a pressing cloth. You only need enough heat for the fusing to adhere. All 4 sides should be fused now. Let's sew the other side of the bag to the zip. Align your edges and notches together and clip it in place. Don't sew right from the ends. Start and finish at your marked lines. We need to leave an opening for turning the bag out later. And like the other side of the zip, sew just shy of 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch, carefully matching your notches and edges as you go. That's the zip sewn to the main body of the bag. As you can see, I haven't sewn past the marked lines. Previously, I sewed the lining before clipping the triangles out of the curved opening, but here I've clipped it first. It doesn't matter what order you do this in. Then sew the lining onto the seam. Exactly the same method as the previous side, but don't edge stitch just yet. Here's what the bag looks like now. It is coming together. Carefully clip into your marked lines. Cut right into the point of stitch line, but don't go past it. This is why we fused this area, so the clipped seam is reinforced. Pull your lining out and clip to the sides of the bag. This time, edge stitch from your clipped seam. You can flick the seam allowance out to help you see where to start and finish, but be careful you don't go past those points. Give yourself a little pat on the back because you've just completed the trickiest part of the bag. The zip is done, it's all smooth sailing now. Next, open up the zip completely and put right sides together of the main bag. Pull your lining up out of the way. Pull the tie down into the bag so it makes it easier to turn through later. We're going to sew one side first, top stitch it, and then sew the other side, and finally the base. Clip or pin your side seams together and sew a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam. Now open up this seam allowance and clip it in place if you need. If you're sewing with fabric, you can press this open. Measure up 20 centimeters from the base, which is 8 inches, and with a little bit of sticky tape or just something that will rub off, mark this point. Using the sewing foot as a guide, edge stitch up the seam on one side to that sticky tape. The further up you go, the trickier it is. So if you find it's too difficult to go this far, then that's fine. Just go as far as you can. When you get to this point, put your needle down, lift the foot and pivot. Sew across the top a couple of stitches and then come back down the other side of the seam. So don't backstitch at the top and start a new stitch line, just sew one continuous line. That's one side done. Now do exactly the same for the other side. And there we go. We now have 2 nice open side seams. Quickly trim the seam allowance at the top of each side to reduce bulk in the seams. Next, sew the base together, a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam. Press the seam open and edge stitch. You can do the same as the sides, pivot at the end and sew one continuous line instead of stopping and starting. Finally, pull the corners together, align the side and base seams, clip and sew a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam. Now it's time for the lining. At this point, annoyingly, you'll have to change your machine settings back to sew normal fabric for the next few steps. Pin one of the sides together, sew a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam, press it open, and then do exactly the same to the other side. Next, pin and sew the lining base seam together, but make sure you leave about a 12 centimeter or 4.6 inches opening in the center. Don't sew this part closed because we need the opening to turn the bag through. Finally, sew the corners just like you did for the main bag. Now pull your whole bag through the lining hole to turn it the right way out. Push the corners out of the base with your fingers. This next step is optional and involves adding a base insert to the bag. I used Foamax, a flexible PVC foam board that's lightweight but firm, and it really helps the bag hold its shape, so I do recommend doing this. Cut your base out 9 by 33 centimeters. In inches, that's 3.5 by 13. Insert the base through the gap in your lining and push it into the corners of the bag. I didn't stitch or glue this down. I find it stays in place on its own. Once that's done, you can edge stitch the lining closed. And now the lining is complete. Change your machine settings back to sewing heavyweight fabric or leather. Honestly, this is the part I find the most frustrating, but luckily you won't need to change it again after this. Now we're going to sew the ends of the straps together. So starting with the center strap pieces, match them together. Align your seams so they meet and clip in place. This is a little fiddly just because it's a small area to work with and it's a tube. Sew a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam. Do this slowly and in small sections. As you sew, you can gently pull the next part around, but be careful you don't pull too hard because it may tear the fused clipped opening. Trim off this part of the seam to reduce the thickness. And this is the very last sewing step. Pull out the seam allowance that we clipped into earlier. Match your seams together and sew a straight line from corner to corner. This should be a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam. And finally, trim off the seam allowance. So trim it really close to your stitch line, but don't cut through it. This little section will get hidden by the knot of the tie. And now for the knot, the part the bag is named after. Pull your tie up and over the strap, back around again, and then tuck it through the loop so it creates a knot and it hangs down the side. You can adjust the knot a little so it sits over the raw trimmed edge and hides it neatly. And that's the bag finished. I hope you are happy with yours. I have already got some requests from friends to make them one, so I'm gonna be busy in the upcoming weeks. I would love to see how your bag turned out, so please feel free to tag me on social media, Tess Jean Patterns on Instagram or Tessa Jean Smith on TikTok. If you had any questions, please drop them in the comments below because chances are other people have also had similar questions and I'll be sure to answer them. Please give this video a like and subscribe if you like sewing tutorials like this one. Bye.